In the ancient world, there was a belief shared by kings, prophets, and nations alike. To see God was to die. The divine was too holy, too powerful, too overwhelming for human life to survive. And yet, one man came closer than any other. His name was Moses. This is the story of how a forgotten shepherd became the only human Scripture describes as knowing God face to face and lived to tell it. Moses was not born great, he was born hunted. At the time of his birth, Pharaoh ruled the world, and the Hebrew people were slaves. Pharaoh feared their growing numbers and ordered every Hebrew baby boy to be killed. Moses should have died before he ever took a breath. Instead, he was hidden in a basket and placed on the Nile River, drifting between life and death. By fate or providence, Pharaoh's own daughter found him and raised him as a prince of Egypt. Moses grew up surrounded by power, wealth, and gods of stone, but he never forgot who he was. One day, seeing an Egyptian overseer beating a Hebrew slave, Moses snapped. He killed the man and buried the body in the sand. The prince became a fugitive. Moses fled into the wilderness of Midian, where the future lawgiver of Israel spent 40 years doing something no one would remember: tending sheep. The palace was gone, the power was gone, the ambition was gone. And it was there, in obscurity, that God came looking for him. One ordinary day, Moses saw something impossible. A bush burned with fire, yet it was not consumed. As Moses drew closer, a voice called his name, "Moses, Moses." The ground beneath his feet was declared holy. He was told to remove his sandals, and then, from the fire, God spoke, not through thunder, not through angels, but directly. Moses was afraid. He hid his face. This was not an image, not a body, not a form. It was presence. God revealed his name, "I am who I am," a name that spoke of existence itself, eternal, uncreated, absolute. Moses lived because he did not see God's face, he heard God's voice. And that was only the beginning. God sent Moses back to Egypt to confront Pharaoh. What followed were plagues, miracles, and the collapse of the greatest empire on earth. Moses led Israel through the Red Sea, watched the waters part, and saw his enemies swallowed whole. But the most terrifying encounter was yet to come, at Mount Sinai. When Israel reached the mountain, God descended. The earth shook, fire covered the peak, smoke rose like a furnace, thunder roared, lightning split the sky, the sound of a trumpet grew louder and louder. The people were terrified. God spoke aloud, delivering the 10 Commandments, not to Moses alone, but to an entire nation. The people begged Moses to speak to God for them. They could not endure his voice. So Moses walked where no one else dared, into the fire, into the cloud, into the darkness. Scripture says Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. Darkness not because God was absent, but because he was too present. Moses lived because he concealed himself. From that moment on, Moses' relationship with God was unlike any other. God spoke to Moses regularly, directly, without riddles or dreams. Scripture says God spoke to him face to face as one speaks to a friend. Not literally face to face, because God himself said no human could see his face and live, but without barriers, without intermediaries. When Moses entered the tent of meeting, a pillar of cloud descended. God's voice filled the space. The people watched from afar as Moses stood alone before the presence. No prophet before him, no prophet after him ever experienced this. And then Moses did something unimaginable. He asked for more. "Show me your glory." It was the boldest request a human had ever made. God answered with a warning. "You cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live." But God did not reject Moses. Instead, he made a way. God placed Moses in a cleft of the rock. He covered him with his hand, and as the divine presence passed by, Moses was allowed to see what Scripture calls God's back, not a body, but the afterglow of his passing glory. This was the closest any human has ever come. Moses survived because God shielded him. When Moses descended the mountain, something had changed. His face shone, not metaphorically, physically. Light radiated from his skin. Moses had to cover his face with a veil because the reflection of God's glory was too intense. Moses had not become divine, but he had been marked by the divine. Years later, Moses died on Mount Nebo. He never entered the Promised Land, and in one final mysterious act, Scripture says God himself buried Moses. No grave was ever found. The story ends with a declaration unmatched in the Bible. No prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Moses never saw God's face, but he saw his fire, his glory, his presence, his afterglow, and he lived. Because God chose revelation over destruction, mercy over annihilation, relationship over distance. Moses stands as a reminder that the divine is not conquered by power, but approached through humility, and that while no human can fully see God and live, some are invited close enough to be changed forever.